So we've got the new rules for allying in demons to your chaos forces, demonic armies corrupting entire areas of the board to literally frighten their opponents to death, and the new profile for the Dark Master Be'lakor himself with the ability to keep nearby demons safe from ranged attacks nearby. Let's talk Chaos Demons in Warhammer 40k 10th. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking demons, and we're continuing looking at Games Workshop's previews of the 10th edition Warhammer factions one by one. The personal legions of the Dark Gods have been having a good time of it in 9th, so it's going to be interesting to see how they adapt to 10th edition and the changes that it's going to bring. First up from the article, we did get a couple of core rules reveals as well, just a couple of little extra clarifications that I think were very predictable, but it's good to actually have them confirmed by GW. First up in the article, when they talked about extra attacks weapons, which we'll get onto later, they did say that under normal circumstances you only choose one melee weapon to attack with and can't attack with all of them. This seemed 100% likely from Guilliman's profile, where you had the Hand of Dominion as a sweep attack and the Emperor's Sword as a strike attack. I at least saw a few people down in the comments arguing that you'd be able to attack with both, and Guilliman will be getting something like 24 odd attacks with his profiles, which just seemed very, very unlikely. So good to have that confirmed in any case. Looks like there is a rule called extra attacks though, which is for weapons where you get to attack with both the one and the other. The other useful thing to know was that Objective Control 0 units don't contest objectives at all. Again, that is how I would have guessed it would have been played. My suspicion was that it would just literally be the opponent that had the most objective control points on the objective, and if you've got none in a unit, then it's not going to do anything. But there was still the possibility that an Objective Control 0 unit would still be able to take the point, just if your opponent had any models on it, then they'd be outclassed. It is just confirmation that if your unit takes Battle Shock, it's not going to be doing anything for objectives whatsoever, even if your unit's just sat on its own back in your own deployment zone holding down a point. Core things aside though, we've got plenty of demonic stuff to talk about. Here's the rough summary of the reveals. We've got their core army rule, plus their detachment specific rule, some rules for allied demons, a few weapons and a stratagem preview, and then 2 datasheets. As well as all that, they've confirmed that the whole army will still be able to deep strike. It is a rule that's present on the datasheets it seems, as opposed to just a whole army special rule, and apparently they are confirmed to still be working off invul saves primarily, though a few of them look like they've got saves that match those invul saves, so cover might actually be a little bit more meaningful. There's no mention of their unmodifiable super invuls that they got with the 9th edition codex. I think that there is a pretty reasonable chance that Games Workshop might have listened to some feedback and tried to make invul saves a bit more invulnerable. I wouldn't be too surprised if a few things that bypass them might well be gone. It does seem that Be'lakor's sword has been toned down in that way, it no longer cuts straight through unnatural barriers. Otherwise, the army's special rule is Shadow of Chaos. You basically take objectives to help and hinder Battle Shock tests for both players. Usually the idea looks like it's hold the mid-board to mess with your opponent's army and potentially regenerate yourself some demons. The Demonic Incursion rule also plays off Shadow of Chaos. This is the one where you get to deep strike close to your enemy, though you can only do it if they're somewhere under the influence of the shadow. The Allied Demons is a nice simple 25% of most armies being able to take Chaos Demons, at least the Chaos ones of course. Seems pretty usable to be honest, and I feel like Demons as allies look like they could be a very tempting choice if they do get a strong datasheet or two. For the rules previews, we've got the Great Unclean One's Bileblade, Skarbrand's melee profile, corrupt objectives as a stratagem to push out some more Shadow of Chaos, and then datasheets for the Keeper and Be'lakor. Starting from the top, first up we have Shadow of Chaos. This one's the faction rule that should be present regardless of detachment, and it's basically an area of effect buff and debuff that you get to apply to multiple sections of the board. It's always on for your own deployment zone, so super easy to access there. The other 2 areas of the board though, No Man's Land and your opponent's deployment zone, they're dependent on you taking objectives. This seems to be checked at the start of each phase, so if you've taken objectives at the start of the phase, provided you control half or more of the objectives, either in No Man's Land or in your opponent's deployment zone, then that area of the board will flip to being under Shadow of Chaos. I feel like it should be achievable enough for No Man's Land for quite a bit of the time. If you're not taking even half the objectives, then you're probably having a bad time of it. Probably super hard to do in your opponent's deployment zone though, they're hardly likely to be ignoring their home field objectives. Within this area of influence, it gets you 3 things basically. Basically a Battle Shock buff for you, a Battle Shock debuff for your opponent, and it also feeds in with Warp Rifts, the detachment ability. The buff and the debuff are kind of mirror images of each other to be honest. For the demons themselves, they get +1 to Battle Shock tests. Should mean that they're a decent bit harder to make useless on objectives and to have the problems falling back and stuff. And then also with a kind of fun side benefit, if you happen to pass a battle shock test, then you regenerate D3 wounds on your model, or if the unit is battle line, then you get to set up D3 slain models from earlier in the game. I think both of those things are pretty meaningful, to be honest. Not being battle shocked is going to be super handy for taking those objectives, and regenerating the models looks like it probably would happen with some pretty decent regularity if your opponent leaves your units half killed. It seems like something like a unit of bloodletters will regenerate quite quickly towards half strength if the enemy does put it at below that. Could even be a weird positive effect of some of the other units in 40k that we've seen that trigger battle shock tests. On the flip side, your opponent gets almost the exact opposite of this. They get -1 to battle shock tests if they're within the shadow of chaos. Really quite a big deal with how important they seem. Could make some armies super likely to fail if they've only got leadership 7 base, and then if the test is failed, they take D3 mortal wounds as well, just to add insult to injury. That's not insignificant damage there. It's going to be handed out kind of random and scattergun, but it still seems very good. I feel like between these two rules, it's definitely going to be in the demon player's interest to take the midfield objectives, and then try and subject the foe to a fair bit of battle shock where they can. If there are any units in the demon army that can force battle shock tests, then that's going to be particularly relevant. As mentioned, it also helps with warp rifts as well. We'll get onto that in just a second. I feel like it is going to make the fight for no man's land feel super important though. If there's only say 3 objectives in the midfield, then I feel like there's a decent chance that your opponent is going to be repeatedly flipping it back to out of the shadow. Might be a bit easier to do if there's 4 objectives in no man's land. You can focus on holding half of them and then keep a huge amount of the board in shadow. Next up, we've got Warp Rifts. This also feeds into the previous ability, and it's the detachment special rule for Demonic Incursion. This sort of seems part of the way to the Demonic Manifestation rules that we had in 9th edition, the various abilities for demons to drop in dead close. This one's a very simple version of that previous rule. If you're setting up your unit wholly within an area that's controlled by the Shadow of Chaos, then that unit can choose to set up just outside of 6 inches of enemy units rather than the normal greater than 9 inches. Again, I suppose that's yet more confirmation that the regular deep strike rules are still going to be out to 9 inches, so quite unreliable to make charges from normally. It does seem like really quite a powerful rule, to be honest. A 9-inch charge is usually about a 27% chance, and a 6-inch charge is usually about a 72%. Massively more likely to go off without needing to invest in command point rerolls, and also a better investment of a command point if it happens to fail. Seems like it could still be very worth having a melee unit or 2 hiding in deep strike, perhaps Bloodletters being the classic example of this from 9th edition. It would punish your opponent if they stray too close to your deployment zone and gift you some easy charges, and if you can get the shadow on the midfield, it's going to be super easy to get them into whole swathes of the opposing army. I do feel like one disadvantage of that though is perhaps the fact that the reserves happen in the movement phase, but the Shadow of Chaos check seems to be checked at the start of the phase, so that'll be before you get to move your units. I feel that's maybe a little bit unfortunate for the demons maybe. If the opponent manages to unshadow the midfield objectives in their turn, it means that you're not going to have chance to put things right until after your movement phase, so it could limit where your units are going to deep strike. Still though, seems pretty powerful, and again looks like it's going to put even more emphasis on taking the midfield with your troops. Be'lakor also gets some Shadow of Chaos as well, and again it looks like he's going to be a good delivery mechanism for close range melee. I think one thing that's going to be particularly interesting to a bunch of Chaos players out there are the new Allied Demons rules though. Pretty handy that Games Workshop chose to include these just as part of the Demons preview. It is quite nice to know how you're going to be able to field them. This rule set seems a lot more simple and intuitive compared with the previous version where you were messing around with power level even if you happen to be playing a game with points, and it looks like in 10th edition there's no requirements to do any sort of army organisation. You can literally take the units that you want as opposed to having to mess about with patrols. The core rule does seem to be based on the game size. For Incursion it's up to 250 points worth of demons. For Strike Force, usually at 2000 points, it's going to be up to 500 points of demons, and for Onslaught it's going to be up to 750. That'd be a 3000 point game normally. Basically a quarter of your army can be demons, and it looks like you can pick the exact units that you want as well. So if demons get any particularly powerful datasheets, they're going to be easy to throw into other Chaos forces. As before, there are a few restrictions. It's kind of nice to see both Chaos Knights and standard Chaos Space Marines basically don't have any though. Previously I believe that in Arcs of Omen the Chaos Knights were temporarily banned from running any Chaos Demons allies, which seemed a bit weird. Nothing obvious to restrict that at the moment though. As before, the biggest restrictions are to the god-specific legions. Basically, if you're playing World Eaters, Death Guard or Thousand Sons, you can only take their patron deity, and it's kind of interesting how they've handled Emperor's Children now that sub-factions broadly seem to be going away. The only restriction on fielding demons alongside Emperor's Children is that if you're playing standard Chaos Space Marines and Lucius the Eternal happens to be your warlord. Otherwise though, this does look just very de-restrictive. I feel like demons could definitely be a popular ally to certain armies. Seems potentially very useful to have a few infantry units dotted around for Chaos Knights and things, or we could go some Monster Mash Chaos, maybe take a Greater Demon alongside some Knights maybe. From what Games Workshop have previously said, it sounds like all you're going to be getting with adding the demons in is their core datasheet. You don't get any of their detachment rules, like their stratagems, Shadow of Chaos or Warp Rifts. Though to be honest, I'm really not sure how big a deal that's going to be. Your main army will still be getting its main faction rule. You can save the command points for use on your main army, and then just take any raw power that the demons bring, or just raw utility. Overall from this preview, I think it's looking pretty good for allying in some demons. Next up, we've got a couple of weapons, and first up there's the Great Unclean One's Bileblade. I'd say that maybe this one isn't the most interesting profile in the world. It's just literally 3 attacks hitting on 2s with Strength 6, AP 2 and Damage 2 with a lethal hit special rule. Not really the most interesting, but I feel like Games Workshop just showed this off to showcase their extra attacks rule, which we hadn't seen so far. This one seems kind of similar to the Malefic Weapons rule from the Chaos Demons 9th decks, basically having extra attacks on the demon profile, in addition to what you normally get. They did say that extra attacks definitely isn't locked to demons or anything. Certain other units will get it, such as Carnifexes and Cavalry mentioned specifically. I guess Cavalry often get extra attacks with hooves or some sort of biting attack. I guess for Carnifexes could represent a Bone Mace Tail or something else. I guess this means that Great Unclean Ones will have a generic attack profile as well as the Bileblade, and it looks like they get lethal hits. I really wouldn't be too surprised if that's a common rule to Nurgle Plague weapons, maybe reinterpreting their reroll wounds type rules. Not really much that you can say about the Great Unclean One from this though. The other profile that we get is some very dangerous axes. We get the profile for Slaughter and Carnage, the 2 axes that Skarbrand, the Bloodthirster with the injured wings, has. I guess serves him right for trying to take on Khorne himself. The profile for these is suitably devastating, though again like really quite a lot of the biggest hits in 10th edition, they are arguably toned down a bit compared with previous in 9th. The Strike mode gets you a massive 8 attacks at hitting on 2s at strength 16, AP 4 and damage 6, really quite brutal damage there. It has lost its Ignores or Invuls ability though, and I feel like despite the upgrade to damage 6 from D3 plus 3, it still means that that's weaker overall. Still though hardly something that you really want to get in the way of. It averages about 26 wounds to vehicles turn on turn without an Invul save, or still about 18 wounds on one that has a 5 plus Invul. You're still odds on to scrap something like a Repulsor in a single round of combat. The Strike mode gets you 16 attacks, hitting on 2s at 8 strength 8, AP 1 and damage 2. That lost a pip of AP. It's still going to kill you something like 5 or 6 dead intercessors though. I think it's still looking suitably bloodthirsty. Next up we also get one stratagem from the Demonic Incursion detachment. This one's Corrupt Real Space, and there's a bit of a utility one that you can do on objectives which has a couple of useful effects. You use it on your command phase on an objective that's within control range of one of your Legion's Demolica units. The 2 effects that it brings are that first up it allows your units to move off it and still hold the objective. This I guess could be pretty handy late game to be honest. Say you've got a dirty great big greater demon that still wants to take the fight to the enemy. They don't really want to be sat around on objective duty, so I guess this could get them out of that. I suppose could also be insurance against your unit getting battle shocked. The other thing though also gives you a 6-inch aura of Shadow of Chaos next to it. That'd be quite big, as I guess it will probably go out from the edges of the objective marker rather than the centre. A decent chunk of the board there, and I suppose that could be handy on midfield objectives if you think there's a reasonable chance that you're not going to be able to hold half the objectives long term. Could be quite an interesting defensive one and allow you to bring in those reserves super close to the enemy for some short charges. I feel like this sort of aura from a nearby objective just isn't going to be the sort of thing that your opponent's going to be able to avoid very easily. Overall, I feel like it definitely seems useful. I'm sort of a bit dubious as to how well it's really going to compete with the other demon stratagems once we see them though. Command points are really worth quite a bit in 10th. This one seems like it's just could be an investment that might well do nothing later in the game, and I feel like things that are a bit more direct just might be a bit more predictable. Definitely seems useful enough to have in the options though. Finally, we've got a couple of chunky datasheets, and Games Workshop seems to have gone for the big critters to show off here. First up, we've got the Keeper of Secrets, maybe a greater demon that got a bit overshadowed by Lords of Changes and Bloodthirsters in 9th, but still certainly isn't bad. On the defensive profile, looks like the Keeper of Secrets is toughness 10 now, you are still going to need some pretty hefty guns to shoot it down. Weapons like autocannons, which seem to have gone to strength 9, will need a 5+ to wound it, as will melter weapons. It's lost a couple of wounds down to 18, but the invul save for it has been buffed a little. Previously it was 4+ against range and a 5+ in melee. Now it just looks like it's a 4+ regardless, so I suppose that's a small improvement there. Certainly doesn't look like it's going to be too easy to gun down. It's still got that -1 to hit ability baked in as well. Otherwise, it now looks like it provides an aura of an extra AP -1 in melee to nearby Slaanesh demons. As best I can tell, it looks like this would affect the Keeper's own melee. That's why I guess it's listed as an AP -2 attack profile. It would be going to AP -3 with this. Still very fast and deadly. The combat profile still remains solid enough, I think. The Witstealer Sword getting 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3. The Snapping Claws picking up devastating wounds, so if you happen to roll a 6 to wound there, then it's 3 mortals handed out. Very, very nice. And you get 4 attacks of those at strength 6. And then you've got the option for the second hand for the Keeper of Secrets, a Ritual Knife for a trio of other extra attacks to get it even more melee power, a Living Whip for 6 attacks at damage 2 at close range, or the Shining Aegis, which I feel like on paper looks the best of the bunch. That one gives it a 5+ Feel No Pain type ability, a pretty enormous durability increase there. That equates to a 50% durability increase, effectively having to chew through 27 wounds worth of Keeper rather than 18. Unless that's masses more, I can't help but think that that's probably going to be the way to go. Otherwise, I feel like the psychic powers for the Keeper are kind of interesting as well. They've been replaced by just a single Phantasmagoria attack, anti-infantry shooting with 6 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 6 AP -2. It's got devastating wounds like other psychic attacks that we've got, and again like other psychic there's the option to basically overcharge it and make it a hazardous weapon. That one gets you 9 attacks, though I can't help but think unless you really need to kill every single infantry model, that's going to be quite a powerful cost to pay. If you're rolling with 9 dice and you get mortal wounds on a hit roll of 1, that's on average going to cost you 1 or 2 mortal wounds on your Keeper, and it just might not be worth frying an extra infantry model or 2 for the price of that. Overall though, still seems very usable, really quite fast at 14-inch move. The defense does seem to have improved quite a bit, particularly if you take that Shining Aegis, and then a fairly decent amount of close combat attacks there, lots of things with damage 3. It does look like it's going to be a lot more suited to taking down elite infantry though, as opposed to tough vehicles. It will be wounding most tanks and things on a 5+. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the datasheet for the Dark Master himself. Be'lakor is resplendent in all his dark glory with a new profile, and I'd say for the most part things seem to have shifted around a fair bit on him, though a lot of the similar things that he could do before he can still do now. Statline wise, like the other greater demons, it looks like he's lost 2 wounds, down to 18, and gone up to toughness 10. He's got the stealth rule baked in on his datasheet, which my guess would probably be a -1 to hit against ranged attacks. We still need to see the final wording from that. He's still got a 4+ invul, though I must admit it does look like he might be a little bit easier to kill compared with previous. It doesn't look like there's any successive stacks rules of -1 to hit and wound. Looks like normally it's just going to be his standard profile with stealth, though his shadow form might well protect him against long range. Otherwise for his rules, he's got a 6-inch aura of Shadow of Chaos. It looks like he's another way to get a big bunch of that on the board. It does mean that he could still be a very good delivery system for things like Bloodletters, swooping up the board 12 inches, jumping out a squad of Bloodletters out of Deep Strike Reserve when they're close to the enemy, and having them charge into the enemy and chop them up. Plus the way with that new shadow working, it means that he'll still be terrorising his foes quite a bit, giving them -1 to battle shock after it's done killing them with his sword, and also giving them the chance of taking those mortal wounds as well, which feels very appropriate for big scary shadow demon. Like the Keeper of Secrets, Betraying Shade seems to have a similar sort of flavour. It's still a powerful psychic attack that's very anti-infantry. It's a flurry of strength 5 or strength 6 hits out to 18-inch range, all at damage 1 and with devastating wounds. The overcharge one at least adds you a bit more strength and AP this time round, as well as extra attacks. Though again I can't help but think it's going to be a steep price to pay to on average take 2 mortal wounds to Be'lakor if you use the upgraded version. I feel like you really need the extra damage output to justify that. For his combat, along with Skarbrand, it looks like his blade no longer ignores invul saves at base, probably for the best for the game of 40k as a whole to be honest. His shadowy sword now gives you 6 attacks at strength 14, AP -4 and damage d6 +1. Still potent against very tough stuff, though less so against things with invuls, and he's still got his sweep mode for a bunch of attacks at strength 8, AP 3. Finally, the big rule that he gets on his datasheet is his Shadow Form ability. This is another one of the ones that seems to be fairly common to the biggest baddest models around. At the start of the battle round you get to pick of one of these 3 different abilities. Perhaps the single most interesting one in my opinion is Wreathed in Shadows. This one gives you an aura of 6 inches to Legion's Demonica units, and it means that they can't be attacked by ranged attacks unless the attacking model is within 18 inches. This one is a really big deal, and it does again look like it's going to be affecting Be'lakor himself. If he chooses this one, essentially he's going to be invulnerable to backfield fire support from enemy armies. They just simply won't be able to target him unless they get close. Seems like Games Workshop isn't too adverse to handing this sort of rule out. We already saw it for the Chaos Space Marines for their Nurgle stratagem. I feel like this one could be a really big spanner in the works for gun lines. You could have this affect a decent chunk of your army, and the enemy just wouldn't be able to shoot them even if they were completely exposed. If they get within 18 inches, they're definitely within charge range of Be'lakor, and that's not a place that a lot of armies are going to be able to afford to be. Otherwise, he's got 2 other options if that one's not so relevant, say if you're playing a full enemy melee army perhaps, and one of them is an ability that can hopefully force a few more Battle Shock tests out. That one's his Pall of Despair, and that means that the enemy will have to take Battle Shock if they've taken any casualties at all, even if they're not below half strength. It also applies to single model units if they've taken any wounds. That's going to be super relevant in combination with his Dark Master aura. It means that those units will be taking Battle Shock on -1 leadership and taking mortal wounds if they fail. Forcing those extra tests could be fun, and if the long range protection against range damage just isn't relevant, this one seems an excellent second choice. Finally, the last ability is a Battle Shock one, allowing you to reroll Battle Shock and leadership tests taken for the units within 6 inches. Again, I'd probably have this one as the last fallback I think, if the other 2 aren't going to be too relevant. Again though, it really could be one that depends on the opponent's Battle Shock abilities. If you think that there's a reasonable chance that you're just going to get Battle Shocked off an objective, this one seems like some nice defense. Overall, I feel like he's broadly kept with the spirit of what he had before. A big, tough, dangerous demon that's going to be fairly hard to kill. I feel like the biggest shift in the way that he can be used, though, is that you can basically use him as a ranged shield for a good chunk of your demon army within 6 inches of him. If you castle up to him, that could be massively disruptive for armies that just rely on firepower. Tower and Imperial Guard, I think, would really not enjoy that. So anyway, some pretty interesting stuff for the demons there. Let me know what you think down in the comments, as always. After the previews, I think perhaps one of my favourite things might be the Allied Demons rules. They just seem very simple and intuitive, and it looks like other armies will be able to make very good use of allies now. The Shadow of Chaos and Warp Rifts I think are nice enough, but perhaps that Be'lakor shield against ranged attacks seems like one of the other most powerful things, provided Be'lakor's efficient enough on his points I suppose. Look forward to hearing your takes though, let me know what you think might be interesting. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page too, and that's linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.